Welcome to Unheard Fears. Oregon's dark secrets run deeper than most realize. Tonight, 9 true accounts that will challenge everything you thought you knew about this state. For privacy, names and certain details have been altered, but make no mistake, every single one of these stories is 100% real. These events happened to real people in real locations across Oregon. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. If you're ready to dive into the darkness, hit that subscribe button and let's uncover these disturbing truths together. My name is Keon, and I'm an industrial demolition inspector working out of Portland. I've been doing this job for 6 years now, and I've seen my share of abandoned buildings in terrible condition: rotted wood, collapsed ceilings, asbestos, mold, you name it. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered at the old paper mill in Oregon City back in March 2019. People ask me why I still do this work after what happened, and honestly, I don't have a good answer. Maybe it's because nobody else would believe me if I quit and tried to explain why. Maybe it's because I need to convince myself it was real. The mill had been abandoned since 2001, sitting empty for nearly 2 decades. The company that owned it finally decided to tear it down and sell the land for redevelopment. My job was simple: conduct a thorough safety inspection before the demolition crew came in. Standard procedure. I'd done dozens of these before. I arrived at the site around 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. The building was massive, 5 stories of concrete and rusted metal, windows broken out, graffiti covering the lower levels. The smell hit me first, that familiar scent of decay and stagnant water that fills every abandoned industrial building. I'd smelled it 100 times before. It didn't bother me anymore. I started on the ground floor, documenting structural damage, checking for hazardous materials, marking areas that would need special attention during demolition. Everything was normal. Predictable damage patterns from years of water exposure and neglect. I worked my way up floor by floor, taking photos, making notes on my tablet, checking my measurements against the original building plans. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, it was early afternoon. The 3rd floor had been the main production area back when the mill was operational. Huge open spaces where the machinery used to sit, now just empty concrete floors with bolt holes and oil stains. I walked through the eastern section without incident, then moved toward the western corridor. That's when things started feeling wrong. The temperature changed first. Most abandoned buildings are cold, especially in March, but this was different. The air felt warm, almost humid, like walking into a greenhouse. I checked my thermometer out of curiosity. 68 degrees. The rest of the building had been hovering around 45. That didn't make sense. There was no heating system active, no sunlight reaching this corridor, nothing that would explain a 20-degree temperature increase. I made a note of it and kept walking. Then I noticed the walls. The paint was peeling everywhere in the building, nothing unusual about that. But in this corridor, the walls looked different. The surface seemed uneven, almost rippled, like the drywall had swollen from water damage. I reached out and touched it. The wall was warm. Not just warm, actually hot to the touch like a fever. And it wasn't dry. My fingers came away slightly damp, covered in a thin film of moisture that felt too thick to be condensation. It had an oily quality that made my skin crawl. The smell in this corridor was different too. Underneath the normal decay smell, there was something organic, almost meaty, like spoiled produce mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. I should have left right then. Every instinct told me to get out of that corridor and mark it as a biohazard zone. But I'm thorough, maybe too thorough, and I needed to document the extent of the damage before I could file my report. I pressed my hand flat against the wall to check the structural integrity. The surface gave slightly under the pressure, yielding in a way that drywall and concrete shouldn't. Then I felt it. A pulse. rhythmic, steady, like a heartbeat. I jerked my hand back and stared at the wall. I must have imagined it. Buildings don't have pulses. I touched it again, lighter this time, just my fingertips. There it was again. A distinct rhythm, roughly 60 beats per minute traveling through the wall surface. I pulled out my phone and started recording video. I needed evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. As I filmed, the paint began peeling away on its own, large sections curling and falling to the floor. Underneath, the surface wasn't concrete or drywall. It was pink, flesh-colored, with visible veins running through it like capillaries under skin. I watched in horror as the surface continued to pulse, the movement becoming more pronounced, more obvious. The membrane, because I couldn't think of it as a wall anymore, was breathing. I could hear it now, a wet, labored sound like fluid-filled lungs, struggling for air. The moisture seeping through wasn't water. It was thicker, viscous, with a pale reddish tint. I stumbled backward and felt my boots stick slightly to the floor. Looking down, I saw the concrete was also changing, becoming softer, tackier. My mind raced through possible explanations. Mold, some kind of massive fungal growth, bacterial contamination, chemical reaction from industrial waste. Nothing fit what I was seeing. I needed to get out, file an emergency report, get a hazmat team in here. I turned toward the door I'd entered through. It wasn't there anymore. The doorway had sealed itself, the opening filled with the same pink membrane tissue that covered the walls. I could see the outline of where the door had been, but the entire opening was now blocked by what looked like scar tissue growing over a wound. I ran to the other end of the corridor, where a second exit should have been. Same thing, completely sealed. The walls continued their rhythmic pulsing, and I realized the breathing sound was getting louder, faster. Like whatever this thing was, had become aware of my presence and was responding to it. The temperature kept climbing. 70 degrees, 75. I was sweating now, my shirt sticking to my back. The smell intensified, that rotting meat odor mixing with something chemical and sharp that burned my nostrils. I tasted copper in my mouth, that metallic tang that appears before you vomit. My hands were shaking as I examined the sealed doorway, looking for any gap I could pry open. The tissue was thick, maybe 3 inches of solid organic matter blocking the entire frame. I took out my utility knife and tried to cut through it. The blade sank in easily, and the membrane split apart like cutting into raw liver. Dark fluid oozed out, thick and warm. The breathing sound became a wheeze, then almost a moan like the building was in pain. I cut a larger opening, working frantically, trying to create a gap large enough to squeeze through. But the tissue was regenerating almost as fast as I could cut it, growing back, filling in the wounds I created. I could see tendrils of new growth reaching across the gaps, knitting themselves together. Behind me, I heard a wet tearing sound. I spun around and saw sections of the wall membrane bulging outward, stretching, like something was pushing from the other side, trying to break through. The bulges moved along the wall, traveling up toward the ceiling and down toward the floor, creating wave-like patterns across the surface. Some of the bulges split open, revealing dark, hollow spaces behind the membrane, like mouths or wounds, breathing that thick, humid air into the corridor. I pulled out my phone to call for help. No signal. 3 floors up in a concrete building, that wasn't surprising, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I tried anyway, dialing emergency services over and over, getting nothing but silence. The floor beneath my feet was becoming noticeably softer, and I could feel it moving now, undulating slightly with each pulse from the walls. I looked down and saw my boots had sunk nearly an inch into what used to be solid concrete. The surface around my feet was pink and moist, actively dissolving the rubber of my boot soles. I could smell burning rubber, mixing with all the other terrible smells filling the corridor. That's when I noticed the equipment. My gear bag was sitting against the wall where I'd set it down when I first started examining the corridor. Except now it was partially embedded in the wall tissue, being absorbed into the membrane. I could see the outline of my tools through the translucent surface, suspended in the organic matter like insects trapped in amber. The metal was tarnishing, breaking down, being digested. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just alive. It was feeding, consuming anything that stayed in contact with it long enough. And I was next. Panic overrode rational thought. I charged at the sealed doorway, slamming my shoulder into the tissue barrier with all my weight. The membrane gave way, stretching, but not breaking, bouncing me back like a rubber wall. I hit it again and again, each impact creating a deep depression that slowly reformed. The tissue was strong, elastic, refusing to tear no matter how hard I hit it. My shoulder ached, my vision blurred from exertion and fear. The air was so hot now I could barely breathe. 90 degrees, maybe more. The moisture had condensed into actual droplets running down the walls, down my face, soaking my clothes in that oily, blood-tinged fluid. I remembered the windows. The corridor had windows facing the exterior of the building. They were boarded up from outside, but glass and wood were better than living tissue. I ran to the nearest window, my boots making wet, sucking sounds with each step as the floor tried to hold onto them. The window frame was standard size, about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. The boards covering it from outside were visible through gaps where the glass had been broken out years ago. I grabbed a piece of broken metal pipe from the debris on the floor and started smashing at the boards, hitting them from inside, trying to knock them loose. The wood was old and weather damaged. After a dozen hits, one board cracked, then split. I kept hitting it, widening the gap, letting real air, cold, clean air from outside, rush into the corridor. The breathing sound became a shriek. The walls rippled violently, the pulse rate accelerating to something frantic and irregular. The membrane tissue around the window started growing rapidly, reaching toward the gap I'd created, trying to seal it. I smashed away more boards, cutting my hands on broken glass and wood splinters, not caring, just focused on making the opening large enough. The tissue was climbing up the window frame now, tendrils of pink, organic matter stretching across the gap, like fingers trying to close a wound. I threw my tool belt through the opening, then hoisted myself up onto the windowsill. The membrane wrapped around my ankle, hot and wet and strong, pulling me back. I kicked frantically, my boot coming off, leaving it behind in the tissue's grip. I threw myself through the window opening and fell 12 feet into the old loading bay below, landing hard on ancient concrete, feeling something snap in my ankle. The pain was incredible, but I didn't stop. I crawled, then limped, then ran on my broken ankle, getting as far from that building as possible. When I finally looked back from across the parking lot, the building looked completely normal. Gray concrete, broken windows, graffiti. No pink tissue, no breathing walls, just a regular abandoned paper mill waiting for demolition. I passed out from the pain and shock. A construction worker from a neighboring site found me 2 hours later and called an ambulance. I tried to explain what happened. The EMTs thought I was delirious from the injury. At the hospital, they treated my broken ankle, diagnosed me with severe dehydration and possible heat stroke. When I insisted about the walls, about the living building, they scheduled me for a psychiatric evaluation. My company sent a different inspector to the mill the next day. His report described standard structural decay, no anomalies, building cleared for demolition. They demolished it 3 weeks later. Nothing unusual was found. But I know what I experienced was real. I still have the scars on my hands from the window glass. My boots were never recovered. And sometimes, late at night, I can still feel that pulse, that rhythmic breathing, like it left an imprint on my nervous system that won't fade. I don't know what that building became in those 18 years of abandonment. I don't know if it was some kind of massive organism, or if the building itself somehow came alive, or if there's an explanation that science hasn't discovered yet. What I do know is that there are things in abandoned places that we don't understand, things that grow in the dark when nobody's watching. And now I check every wall I touch, waiting to feel that pulse again, terrified of the day when I do. My name is Madeline, and I worked as an emergency services coordinator for Tillamook County back in September 1997. I'd been in the position for 3 years at that point, managing disaster response protocols, coordinating with police and fire departments, and running the monthly tsunami warning siren tests from our underground bunker facility near the coast. It was routine work most of the time, paperwork and drills and community outreach programs. The pay wasn't great, but I liked the stability, liked knowing I was helping keep people safe. On September 15th, I ran a test that changed everything I thought I understood about reality. What happened in that bunker, in those 12 minutes that felt like 6 hours, still haunts me every single day. The worst part isn't what I experienced. The worst part is finding out it happened before and knowing it will happen again. The monthly siren test was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Standard procedure, same as I'd done 35 times before without incident. The system was straightforward, a network of 12 coastal warning sirens that could be activated from the control panel in our facility. The bunker itself was built in the 1960s during the Cold War, originally designed as a fallout shelter before being repurposed for emergency management. It sat 30 feet underground, reinforced concrete walls 3 feet thick, accessible only through a steel door and a narrow stairwell. I was alone that day. My assistant had called in sick, and my supervisor was at a conference in Salem. Being alone didn't concern me. I'd run tests solo plenty of times. I descended the stairs at 1:45, carrying my clipboard and a thermos of coffee. The bunker was always cold, maintaining a constant 55 degrees year-round, regardless of surface temperature. The fluorescent lights flickered on as I hit the switch, illuminating the main control room with its banks of outdated equipment and wall-mounted maps. Everything looked exactly as it had during last month's test. I went through my pre-activation checklist, verifying each siren's connection status, checking power levels, confirming radio communications with the county dispatch center. All systems showed green. At exactly 2 o'clock, I initiated the test sequence. The sirens activated normally at first. Through the monitoring speakers in the control room, I could hear each one come online in sequence, that familiar rising wail that everyone recognizes as a warning signal. Then, about 15 seconds into the test, the tone changed. The frequency dropped, becoming deeper, lower than the sirens were designed to produce. It wasn't just deep, it was impossibly low, a bass vibration that I felt more than heard. My teeth started vibrating in my jaw. The coffee in my thermos began rippling in concentric circles. The overhead lights flickered in rhythm with the pulse of the sound. I looked at the frequency readout on the control panel. The display showed numbers that didn't make sense, frequencies below the range of human hearing, yet I could feel them resonating through my entire skeleton. I tried to shut down the test. I hit the emergency stop button, pulled the master power switch, even started yanking cables from the control board. Nothing worked. The sirens kept broadcasting that terrible low frequency, and the equipment in the bunker started behaving erratically. Screens that should have been dark lit up with cascading strings of numbers. Radio speakers crackled with static that sounded almost like voices, whispering in a language I'd never heard, but somehow felt I should understand. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, my breath visible in the air, frost forming on the metal surfaces of the equipment racks. That's when the phone calls started coming in. The emergency line lit up with incoming calls, the display showing 7, then 15, then 23 people trying to reach me simultaneously. I grabbed the headset and answered. The voice on the other end was panicked, screaming about something coming out of the ocean. Before I could ask for details, the line went dead. I answered another call. Different voice, same terror, describing a figure walking up from the surf, massive in scale, but the description made no sense. The caller said it was tall as a building, but also said it was the size of a person, said it had too many limbs, or no limbs at all, said it was beautiful and horrible, and impossible to look at directly. The call cut off mid-sentence. I answered 6 more calls. Each person described seeing something during the siren test, but none of the descriptions matched. Some said it was mechanical, others said organic. Some said it came from the water, others from the sky. One man insisted it came from beneath the ground, erupting through the sand. The only consistent detail was the scale. Everyone agreed it was enormous, and everyone agreed they couldn't quite focus on it, like their eyes refused to process what they were seeing. I tried calling out to emergency services to get police and fire units responding to the beach, but my outgoing calls wouldn't connect. I could receive but not send, could hear but not speak. The equipment monitors started displaying information I didn't understand. Geographic coordinates scrolled across screens, but the numbers were wrong. Latitude and longitude values that exceeded the possible range for Earth's surface. Some coordinates showed negative values where they shouldn't exist. Others used number systems I didn't recognize, symbols mixed in with digits. I'm not a mathematician or a scientist, but I knew enough to recognize that what I was seeing violated basic geography. One monitor began displaying what looked like a map, but the coastline was wrong. The terrain features didn't match Oregon, didn't match anywhere I'd ever seen. The map rotated slowly, showing angles and perspectives that made my head ache, geometry that shouldn't be possible in 3-dimensional space. I tasted metal in my mouth, strong and chemical, like licking a battery. My hands were shaking as I continued trying to regain control of the system. The air itself felt wrong, thicker somehow, resistant as I moved through it. I could see faint distortions in space near the equipment, like heat shimmer on a hot road, except the room was freezing. The distortions formed patterns, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, angles that seemed to fold in on themselves. I felt dizzy, nauseated, my sense of balance failing. The floor felt tilted even though I could see it was level. Time became elastic. I would look at the clock and see 2 minutes had passed, but I'd swear it had been 30. I'd glance away and back again, and the clock would show less time than before, numbers rolling backward. My watch disagreed with the wall clock, disagreed with the timestamp on the computer monitors, every timepiece showing a different reality. I started taking notes, documenting everything, trying to maintain some connection to normal procedure. When I looked at what I'd written, the words weren't in English. The characters looked almost like letters, but wrong, mirror reversed or rotated, or combined in ways that shouldn't form coherent symbols. Yet I could read them. I understood perfectly what I'd written, even though the language wasn't anything I'd ever learned. The siren tone shifted again, rising back toward normal frequency. But now there were harmonics, multiple tones layered over each other, creating interference patterns that seemed to carry information. I found myself swaying in time with the pulses, my body responding to rhythms I couldn't consciously hear. My vision blurred, and for a moment I saw the control room overlaid with something else, another space occupying the same location. Walls made of material that wasn't quite solid, structures that extended in directions I couldn't name. I saw figures in that other space, tall and thin and utterly alien, working at consoles similar to mine, but incomprehensibly complex. One of them turned toward me, and I felt its attention like a physical weight. It had no face I could describe, no features that my mind could properly process, but I knew it was aware of me, studying me with the same confusion I felt studying it. The overlay faded, snapping back to normal reality so abruptly I stumbled and caught myself against the control board. The sirens cut off. Sudden silence, so complete my ears rang from the absence of sound. All the equipment returned to standby mode simultaneously. The temperature normalized. The distortions in the air vanished. I stood there, gasping, trying to process what had just happened. I looked at the clock. 12 minutes had elapsed since I started the test. 12 minutes. It had felt like hours, like an entire afternoon had passed in that bunker with those impossible sights and sounds and sensations. I grabbed my notes and ran up the stairs, bursting out into daylight that seemed too bright, too normal. I drove straight to the main office and tried to explain what happened to my supervisor. He listened patiently, then showed me the automated log from the siren system. According to the official record, the test had run normally for exactly 90 seconds, then shut down as programmed. No anomalies recorded, no extended duration. I called several of the people who had phoned in during the incident. None of them remembered calling. No memory of seeing anything unusual. No memory of the test at all. I checked with dispatch. They had no record of receiving multiple emergency calls that afternoon. Their logs showed routine traffic only. I went home and looked at my notes. They were in English now, normal handwriting, normal words, describing a completely routine siren test with no irregularities. But I remembered writing something different. I remembered those alien symbols, that impossible language. I found my watch, the one I'd been wearing in the bunker. It had stopped at 2:07, frozen exactly 7 minutes into the test. I never got it working again. The next morning, I went to the county archives on a hunch. I requested all documentation related to the emergency siren system going back to its installation. It took 3 days of searching through boxes of old files, but I found them. 2 incident reports, one from September 1978, another from September 1952. Different coordinators, different specific details, but the core description was identical. Impossible low frequency, temporal distortion, calls about something emerging from the ocean, equipment displaying wrong coordinates, notes written in unknown languages. Both previous coordinators had documented their experiences, and both reports had been filed away and forgotten. The 1978 coordinator had added a personal note stapled to her report. It said simply, "It will happen again in September 1997. I don't know what it wants, but it's listening through the sirens. For God's sake, disconnect the system before that date." She'd signed it and dated it. The report had never been acted upon. The system had never been disconnected. And it had happened exactly as she predicted. I added my own report to the file, documented everything I could remember. I calculated forward. September 2016 would be the next occurrence, based on the 19-year pattern. I wrote a warning, explicit instructions to shut down the siren system for the month of September 2016. I filed it properly, made copies, sent them to my supervisor and to the State Emergency Management Office. 3 months later, I was transferred to a different position. My replacement never received my notes. Or if he did, he didn't take them seriously. I followed up in 2016, called the office in September, tried to warn them. The person I spoke with had no idea what I was talking about. No record of my report. No knowledge of the previous incidents. I don't know if it happened again that year. I moved out of state in 2015. Couldn't stand being near the coast anymore. Couldn't handle the anxiety of waiting for September to arrive. But I still think about it constantly. I dream about that overlaid space, those impossible figures at their incomprehensible consoles. I wonder what they were doing, whether they were trying to communicate or simply didn't realize we were here. I wonder what came out of the ocean that day, what all those people saw before their memories were erased or rewritten. Most of all, I wonder what will happen in September 2035, and whether anyone will be ready for it this time. Have you ever experienced something that everyone else insists never happened, but you know deep down was absolutely real? My name is Maurice, and I was working as an overnight nursing volunteer at a rural hospice facility in Fossil back in December 2015. Fossil's a tiny town. Population maybe 400 on a good day. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing much happens. The hospice sat on the edge of town, a converted ranch house with 6 beds, caring for terminal patients who wanted to spend their final days somewhere quiet. I'd been volunteering there for about 8 months, doing overnight shifts twice a week. The pay was minimal, just gas money really, but I'd recently lost my grandmother to cancer and wanted to do something meaningful. The work was usually peaceful, just monitoring patients, keeping them comfortable, being there so they weren't alone. December 18th changed everything. That night turned into a nightmare I've relived thousands of times. A night where I had to make impossible choices, where people died because I couldn't save everyone. I arrived for my shift at 10 that evening. Temperature was below freezing, snow starting to fall, roads already getting slick. The facility had 3 patients that night. An 86-year-old woman with late-stage Alzheimer's, a 72-year-old man with liver failure, and a 90-year-old veteran with terminal heart disease. All 3 were bedridden. All 3 needed assistance with everything. The only other staff member was Natasha, a licensed practical nurse who handled medications and medical assessments. She'd been working there longer than I had, knew the patients well, was efficient and professional. We did our usual handoff with the evening shift, reviewed patient status, checked supplies. Everything seemed routine. Around 11:30, Natasha went to the medication storage room to do inventory and prepare the midnight medication rounds. I was in the common area between the patient rooms, updating charts and listening to the baby monitors we used to hear if anyone needed help. That's when I heard the front door open. Not the sound of a key in the lock, not the beep of someone entering the security code. Just the door opening, hinges creaking, cold air rushing down the hallway. I called out, asking who was there, thinking maybe the night supervisor had decided to stop by for a surprise inspection. No answer. I walked toward the entrance, turned the corner, and saw muddy boot prints on the floor. Large prints, men's size 12 or 13, leading from the front door toward the patient wing. My first thought was that one of the patient's family members had come to visit, even though visiting hours ended at 9, and everyone knew to call ahead for after-hours access. I followed the boot prints, calling out again, getting no response. The prints led past the first 2 patient rooms and toward the medication room where Natasha was working. I knocked on that door, asked if someone had come in to see her. She opened the door looking confused, said she hadn't heard anyone. That's when I noticed the boot prints continued past the medication room, around the corner, toward the back storage area. Something felt deeply wrong. The front door had been locked. I'd checked it myself during rounds. Nobody should have been able to just walk in. I told Natasha something was off, that we needed to check the building. We split up, which I now realize was a stupid decision, but we were worried about the patients and wanted to make sure everyone was safe. I went back toward the patient rooms. Natasha headed toward the storage area to see who'd gone back there. I checked on each patient, found them all sleeping peacefully, unchanged. I was starting to think maybe I'd imagined the boot prints. Maybe they'd been there earlier, and I just hadn't noticed. Then I heard a crash from the direction of the medication room, glass breaking, something heavy hitting the floor. I ran back there and found Natasha on the ground. There was blood everywhere. She'd been attacked with something sharp, multiple wounds to her chest and abdomen, cuts that looked precise, almost surgical in their placement. She was conscious, gasping, trying to speak, but couldn't form words. I dropped down next to her, pressed my hands against the worst of the bleeding, screamed for help, even though I knew nobody else was in the building. I grabbed my phone with bloody hands and dialed emergency services. The dispatcher answered, and I tried to explain what happened, where we were, that we needed police and ambulance immediately. She kept asking me questions, trying to keep me calm, telling me help was coming. Fossil was 40 minutes from the nearest hospital, 20 minutes from the nearest police station. I knew Natasha didn't have 20 minutes. I tried to stop the bleeding, but there were too many wounds, too much damage. She died while I was on the phone with dispatch, just stopped breathing, her eyes going unfocused. I'd never watched someone die before. The dispatcher was still talking, telling me to start CPR, walking me through the steps, but I knew it was useless. Natasha was gone, and whoever killed her was still in the building. The medication room had been ransacked, drawers pulled open, bottles scattered across the floor. The controlled substance cabinet had been pried open, morphine and other painkillers missing. This was a robbery gone wrong, someone looking for drugs who'd been willing to kill for them. I stood up, my hand shaking, covered in Natasha's blood, trying to think clearly through the panic. 3 patients, all helpless, all depending on me. One killer, somewhere in the building, armed with a blade, willing to murder for medications. The dispatcher was telling me to get out, to leave the building and wait for police outside. But I couldn't leave the patients. They couldn't move on their own, couldn't defend themselves. If I ran, they'd be completely vulnerable. I told the dispatcher I was staying, that I had to protect the patients. She begged me not to, said it was too dangerous that I'd end up dead too. I hung up on her. The wheelchairs were in the storage closet near the patient rooms. I ran there, planning to evacuate everyone, get them outside into my car, drive away from the building. I opened the closet and found the wheelchairs sabotaged. All 3 had been disabled, wheels removed, frames bent, deliberately destroyed. This hadn't been random. Whoever was here had planned this, had come prepared, had made sure the patients couldn't be moved easily. They'd cut the phone lines too. I discovered that when I tried to use the facility's landline. Only my cell phone was working, and even that had barely any signal this far out in the country. I heard footsteps upstairs. The facility had a second floor mostly unused, just storage space and an old office that nobody went into anymore. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, someone walking room to room, searching. I realized the intruder was looking for me, or maybe for more drugs, or maybe just making sure there were no other witnesses. I had to hide the patients, had to get them somewhere safer than their rooms. But moving bedridden patients without equipment, without help, seemed impossible. The woman with Alzheimer's weighed maybe 90 pounds, but the 2 men were both over 200. I couldn't carry them. I made a decision. I went to each patient room and locked the doors from the inside, wedged chairs under the handles, pushed the heavy medical carts in front of the doors as barricades. It wasn't much, but it might slow the intruder down, might buy time for police to arrive. I checked my phone. Still no word on how far away help was. The dispatcher had said units were responding, but I had no idea if that meant 5 minutes or 50. I grabbed the only weapon I could find, a fire extinguisher from the hallway, and positioned myself in the common area where I could see all 3 patient room doors. The footsteps came down the stairs. I watched the stairwell entrance, fire extinguisher raised, trying to steady my breathing. A figure emerged, tall, wearing dark clothing and a ski mask, carrying what looked like a hunting knife. Our eyes met across the hallway. Neither of us moved for a moment. Then he ran at me. I discharged the fire extinguisher directly into his face, the chemical spray blinding him temporarily. He slashed wildly with the knife, catching my forearm, a burning line of pain that made me drop the extinguisher. I kicked him hard in the knee, heard something crack, and he went down. I should have run then, should have gotten out while he was hurt and disoriented, but I was terrified he'd recover and go after the patients. So I did the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever done. I jumped on him, trying to pin him down, wrestling for control of the knife. We fought in that hallway for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 60 seconds. He was stronger, but I was desperate. The knife clattered away, across the floor. I grabbed for it, got my fingers around the handle, and then he was on top of me, hands around my throat squeezing. My vision started tunneling, darkness closing in from the edges. I swung the knife blindly, felt it connect, felt him jerk away. He scrambled backward, clutching his side where I'd stabbed him, blood seeping through his shirt. We stared at each other again, both injured, both exhausted. Then, from down the hallway, I heard it. An alarm. One of the patients had managed to reach their call button. The alarm was loud, piercing, echoing through the whole building. The intruder looked toward the sound, looked back at me, then made his decision. He ran for the back exit, limping badly, leaving a trail of blood. I heard the door slam, heard an engine start, tires spinning in the snow as he drove away. I collapsed against the wall, shaking, bleeding from the knife wound on my arm, throat bruised and aching. The patient alarm was still ringing. I forced myself to stand to check on who'd triggered it. It was the veteran, the 90-year-old, with the heart condition. He was conscious, frightened, asking what was happening. I told him everything was okay, that help was coming, tried to sound calm even though I was falling apart. Police arrived 12 minutes later, found me sitting in the hallway outside Natasha's body, still holding the bloody knife. They arrested me initially, thought I'd been the one who killed her, that my story about an intruder was fabricated. It took hours of questioning, forensic evidence, and the testimony of the surviving patients before they believed me. They found the intruder's blood trail, tracked his vehicle description from my statement, eventually identified him as a former patient's family member. His brother had died at our facility 2 years earlier, and he blamed the staff for not doing enough, for not managing his pain adequately toward the end. He'd been planning revenge for months, waiting for a night when the facility was understaffed and vulnerable. They caught him 3 days later trying to get treatment for the stab wound at a clinic 2 counties over. 2 of the 3 patients survived that night. The 90-year-old veteran, the one who triggered the alarm that saved my life, died 4 days later. Heart attack, brought on by the stress of that evening. His daughter told me he'd been holding on, trying to make it to Christmas, and that the trauma pushed him past what his body could handle. I carry that guilt. I carry the guilt that Natasha died because I left her alone, because I didn't realize the danger fast enough. I carry the guilt that I couldn't get all the patients out, that my best efforts still resulted in death. The facility closed 6 months later, couldn't recover from the incident, couldn't find staff willing to work there after what happened. I stopped volunteering completely, couldn't set foot in a medical facility without having panic attacks. I still have nightmares about that hallway, about wrestling for the knife, about Natasha's last breaths. People call me a hero, say I saved lives that night. But all I remember is failing to save everyone. If you'd been in my position that night, would you have stayed to protect the patients or gotten out to save yourself? My name is Caitlin, and back in July 2008, I was working as a forest botanist conducting research in the Willamette National Forest along the Mackenzie River Trail. My specialty was tree disease identification and documentation, specifically focusing on how pathogens spread through old-growth forests. The work took me into remote areas most people never see, places where the forest is so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground, where the silence is absolute except for wind through the canopy. I loved the solitude, loved being surrounded by trees that had been growing for centuries before I was born. What happened during that research trip destroyed my ability to enjoy forests, destroyed my sense of direction, and left me questioning whether the natural world follows the rules we think it does. I'd hiked into a particularly isolated section of the forest to document a grove of ancient Douglas firs that satellite imagery suggested might be showing signs of Swiss needlecast disease. The hike took most of the morning, following trails that barely existed anymore, navigating by GPS and topographical maps. By the time I reached the grove around noon, I was already feeling uneasy. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no insects buzzing, none of the usual ambient noise you expect. Just my boots crunching on dead needles and my own breathing. I attributed it to the heat. July in the Cascade Range can be oppressive, especially under a dense canopy that traps hot air close to the ground. The grove itself was remarkable. 24 Douglas firs arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, each tree enormous, probably 300 years old or more. The spacing between them was unnaturally regular, each tree positioned exactly the same distance from its neighbors. I'd never seen a natural formation like it. Trees don't grow in geometric patterns. They compete for resources, for light, creating irregular distributions as stronger trees dominate and weaker ones die off. But these trees formed a near-perfect circle, with precise intervals between each trunk. I documented the formation with photographs and measurements, noting the strangeness in my field journal. As I worked, I noticed markings on the bark. Not natural damage or disease symptoms, but deliberate carvings. Symbols cut into the bark decades ago, now partially healed over, but still visible. The symbols weren't anything I recognized, not Native American petroglyphs or settlers' marks or modern graffiti. They were geometric, angular, repeating in sequences around each tree trunk. Some symbols appeared on multiple trees, always in the same position relative to the ground. I photographed everything, thinking maybe it was some historical surveyor's notation system I wasn't familiar with. The unease I'd felt earlier intensified. Something about those symbols made my skin crawl. I decided to count the trees just to confirm what I'd estimated from my initial survey. I walked the perimeter of the grove, touching each tree as I passed, counting aloud. 17 trees. I stopped, confused. I'd clearly counted 24 from my center position. I counted again, walking the opposite direction. 21 trees. That didn't make sense. I walked the circle a third time, touching each trunk, counting carefully. 19 trees. The number kept changing. I checked my photographs on my camera's display screen. The first photos I'd taken clearly showed 24 trees. Photos taken 10 minutes later showed a different count, different positions. Some trees appeared in one image, but not in another, even though the angle and location should have captured the same view. My GPS started malfunctioning. The coordinates displayed on the screen changed randomly, jumping between locations hundreds of miles apart. One reading placed me in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Another showed coordinates that exceeded the maximum possible values for Earth's latitude. I tried resetting the device, replacing the batteries, everything I could think of. It continued displaying impossible data. My compass was equally useless, the needles spinning slowly in complete circles, never settling on a direction. I pulled out my backup compass, thinking the first one had been damaged or magnetized. The backup did the same thing, that slow, continuous rotation that made no physical sense. I marked my entry path into the grove using surveyor's tape, bright orange strips tied to branches every 20 feet. When I tried to retrace my route out, the tape markers were gone. Not torn down by animals or wind, just absent, like they'd never existed. I walked in what I was certain was the direction I'd come from, following my own boot prints visible in the soft dirt. The prints led me in a circle, right back to the center of the grove. I tried again, choosing a different direction entirely, using the sun's position to navigate west. After 15 minutes of hiking, I emerged into the grove again, approaching from the opposite side but somehow ending up at the same starting point. Panic started setting in. I'd been lost in forests before, temporarily disoriented until I could get my bearings. This was different. This was impossible. I couldn't leave. Every direction I walked looped back to the grove. The trees themselves seemed different each time I returned. The count changed, the positions shifted slightly, but so subtly I couldn't be certain if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks. I checked my watch. 3:15. I'd been in the grove for 3 hours, had attempted to leave maybe a dozen times. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Magnetic anomaly affecting my navigation equipment, vertigo from the heat causing directional confusion, some geological feature creating an optical illusion. The forest was still silent. That complete absence of life that had bothered me earlier now terrified me. No insects meant no pollination, no decomposition, no functioning ecosystem. The silence was wrong, unnatural, like the trees existed in a space separate from the living world. I examined the nearest tree more closely, really studying it for the first time beyond my disease assessment. The bark patterns were mathematically precise. The spirals followed perfect logarithmic curves. The branch angles were identical from tree to tree, each fork positioned at the exact same height, spreading at the exact same degree. These trees weren't just arranged in a pattern. They were the pattern, grown according to rules that had nothing to do with biology. I saw movement then, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. A figure standing among the trees, roughly human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, proportions that didn't match any person. I spun to look directly at it, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. The movement happened again. Different location, same peripheral blur of something upright and watching. I realized I could see it only when I wasn't trying to, only when my attention was focused elsewhere. The moment I looked directly, it vanished. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I pulled out my camera and tried to photograph what I was seeing in my peripheral vision. The photos showed nothing but empty forest. The light was changing, afternoon shadows growing longer, the temperature dropping. I needed to get out before dark. The thought of spending a night in this grove, with those shifting trees and that watching figure, terrified me more than anything I'd experienced. I tried a different approach, closed my eyes and walked in a straight line based on memory of the terrain, not looking at the trees, not letting their positions influence my path. I counted steps, kept my eyes shut, forced myself to trust dead reckoning rather than visual navigation. After 200 steps, I opened my eyes. I was standing at the edge of the grove, looking back at it from outside the tree line. I ran. I didn't stop to figure out how I'd escaped, didn't pause to document anything further. I just ran, following downhill slopes that I hoped would lead to water, to the trail system, to anything familiar. I ran until my lungs burned, and my legs gave out, and then I kept moving, walking fast, looking over my shoulder constantly. I found a stream eventually, followed it downstream until I recognized landmarks, found the main trail as the sun was setting. I hiked by flashlight back to my vehicle, drove straight to the ranger station and tried to explain what happened. The rangers were polite but skeptical. They checked their maps, told me there was no grove matching my description in the area I'd been surveying. The location I'd marked on their map showed only typical mixed forest, no old-growth Douglas fir groves. They suggested I'd gotten turned around, experienced heat exhaustion, maybe mild hallucination from dehydration. They offered me water and suggested I take a few days off before returning to fieldwork. I showed them my photographs. The early images clearly showed the grove, the arranged trees, the carved symbols. But images taken later that afternoon showed normal forest, no patterns, no formations. The metadata confirmed the timestamps, proved the photos were taken in sequence, but the content didn't match. I went back 3 days later with a full ranger team, GPS coordinates logged, prepared to document the grove properly. We hiked to the location. There was no grove, just standard forest. Trees growing in natural random distribution, no carvings, no patterns, nothing unusual. The rangers were sympathetic, but clearly thought I'd had some kind of episode. My supervisor suggested I take medical leave, get evaluated for cognitive issues that might affect my work. I refused, insisted I was fine, that I knew what I'd seen, but I couldn't prove it. The evidence contradicted my testimony. I spent weeks researching, trying to find explanations or similar incidents. I found references to unusual magnetic fields in certain forest areas, phenomena called gravity hills that affect spatial perception. None of it explained the counting trees, the changing numbers, the symbols that appeared and disappeared. I found historical accounts from the 1800s, settlers and trappers reporting areas of forest where directions became confused, where landmarks shifted position. Most accounts were dismissed as superstition or exaggeration. A few mentioned specific groves of trees arranged in circles, places the native peoples avoided, considered cursed or sacred depending on the tribe. I eventually found a photograph in a university archive, black and white image from 1923, showing a grove of Douglas firs arranged in a circle. The caption identified it as being in the Willamette National Forest, exact coordinates matching where I'd been. The photograph showed carved symbols on the trees, symbols identical to what I'd documented. The original researcher's notes described the grove as mathematically anomalous and potentially non-Euclidean in spatial properties. His report was never published. He was found 3 weeks after taking that photograph, 12 miles from where he'd been researching, suffering from severe dehydration and exposure. He claimed the forest wouldn't let him leave, that he'd walked for days in circles. He died in the hospital 2 days later, still insisting the trees had been counting him. I don't do field research anymore. I work in a lab now, analyzing samples other people collect, safe behind microscopes in controlled environments. I still have nightmares about that grove, about walking in circles forever, about that figure in my peripheral vision that I could never quite see. I wonder sometimes if I really escaped, or if I'm still there, walking loops between those trees, counting different numbers every time, while something watches from just outside my field of vision. The photograph from 1923 sits in my desk drawer. I take it out occasionally, stare at those trees, try to understand what I experienced. The grove is still out there, I'm certain of it. It exists somewhere between the coordinates on a map and the reality of the forest. And I think it's waiting for someone else to find it, to walk that circle, to try counting trees that refuse to be counted. Do you believe there are places in nature that exist outside the normal rules of reality? Or is there always a logical explanation? My name is Shyman, and I operated the late-night eastbound Mass light rail train in Portland back in October 2021. I'd been driving trains for the Transit Authority for 7 years by that point, worked every shift imaginable, seen every kind of passenger you can think of. Drunk college kids, exhausted nurses heading home from hospital shifts, homeless folks seeking shelter from the rain, business people who missed their usual trains. You develop a sixth sense after enough years on the rails, learn to spot trouble before it escalates, learn when to call security, and when to just let minor issues slide. October 23rd tested everything I thought I knew about this job and about what's possible in a city that prides itself on being weird but rational. The shift started normally enough. I clocked in at 11, did my standard pre-operation check on the train, verified all systems were functioning, checked that the emergency equipment was accessible. The platform at Gateway Transit Center was nearly empty when I pulled in for my first pickup. Maybe 15 passengers total spread across 4 cars, which was typical for a Saturday night heading toward midnight. Most people don't ride the MAX that late unless they're working overnight shifts or don't have other transportation options. The weather was miserable. Classic Portland October rain. That steady drizzle that soaks through everything and makes the tracks slick and reflective under the platform lights. I proceeded through my route without incident for the first hour, stopped at every station, picked up a handful of passengers here and there, dropped off others. The automated announcements played at each stop. My headlights cut through the rain and darkness, everything mechanical and routine. Around 12:30, somewhere between Gateway and Park Row stations, the passenger assistance light activated for the rear car. That light indicates someone has pressed the request button, usually means a passenger needs help with a wheelchair ramp or has a question about stops or transfers. I acknowledged the signal, made a note to check the rear car when we reached the next station. We pulled into Park Rows. I secured the train, set the brakes, grabbed my radio, and walked back through the cars toward the rear. The middle cars were nearly empty now, just 2 passengers sleeping in seats, 1 person scrolling through their phone. I entered the rear car and stopped. There was a woman sitting alone in the back section wearing clothing that looked wrong somehow. Not outdated exactly, but inappropriate for the weather. Light fabric, no jacket, no umbrella or rain gear. Her clothes were wet, soaked through like she'd been standing in a downpour for hours. And there was something dark on the fabric that might have been mud or might have been something else. She was young, maybe mid-20s, blonde hair plastered to her face, staring straight ahead with an expression that was completely blank. I approached her carefully, asked if she'd pressed the assistance button, asked if she needed help. She turned toward me slowly, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her voice when she spoke was flat, emotionless. She said she needed to get to Gateway Station. I explained we'd just left Gateway, that we were heading eastbound away from there, but I could help her transfer to a westbound train at the next major stop. She repeated that she needed Gateway Station, same flat tone, same blank stare. I asked if she was injured, if she needed medical attention. The dark staining on her clothes was bothering me, looked too much like blood. She didn't respond, just kept staring. I radioed dispatch, explained I had a potentially injured passenger, requested guidance. The dispatcher asked standard questions about the passenger's condition, whether she was responsive, whether she appeared to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. I described what I was seeing. The dispatcher told me to continue to the next station, and they'd have medical personnel meet us there. I turned to tell the woman the plan, but she was gone. Not walked to another part of the car, not moved to a different seat. Just gone. The seat where she'd been sitting was dry, no wet marks, no indication anyone had been there. I searched the entire car, checked the bathrooms, looked between seats thinking maybe she'd collapsed. Nothing. I returned to the operator's compartment feeling deeply unsettled, radioed dispatch to update them. Before I could speak, the passenger assistance light activated again. Same car, rear section. I stared at the indicator light, watched it blink insistently. I did not want to go back there. Every instinct told me something was wrong, that I should evacuate the train, call for backup, refuse to continue the route. But I'm a professional, and passengers depend on me, so I went back. She was sitting in a different seat this time, several rows forward from where she'd been before. Same wet clothing, same dark stains, same blank expression. She spoke without me asking anything. Said she needed Gateway Station. Said she kept missing the stop. I asked her name. She didn't answer. I asked where she'd come from. She said Gateway platform. I explained again that we were moving away from Gateway, that she needed a westbound train. She became agitated, her voice rising but still maintaining that strange flat affect. She said she always missed the stop, said the train never stopped there for her, said she needed to get off at Gateway. The lights in the car flickered. Not a normal power fluctuation, a rhythmic pulsing that matched the cadence of her words. My radio started crackling with static, harsh white noise that made my earpiece painful. The temperature dropped suddenly, cold enough that I could see my breath, cold enough that frost started forming on the windows. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on her. She stood up, and I realized her feet weren't quite touching the floor. She was suspended maybe an inch above the ground, hovering there, water dripping from her clothes and hair, but the droplets floating upward instead of falling down. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran back to the operator's compartment, sealed the connecting door, and brought the train to an emergency stop. I called dispatch, tried to explain what was happening. My words came out jumbled, panicked, probably incoherent. The dispatcher kept asking me to clarify, to explain what emergency justified stopping the train between stations. I told them there was something wrong with a passenger, that she wasn't normal, that she was doing impossible things. The dispatcher's tone shifted to concern, asked if I was feeling all right, suggested I might be experiencing a medical episode. The rear car door opened. I watched through the window as she walked through the middle car, passing the sleeping passengers who didn't react to her presence. She moved toward my compartment with that same stiff mechanical gait. I tried to restart the train, to get moving, to get to a station where I could get help. The controls were dead. Everything powered down simultaneously. Headlights, interior lights, propulsion systems, communication equipment. Complete electrical failure. The only light came from the platform lamps outside and the emergency exit signs running on battery backup. She reached my compartment door, stood there staring at me through the window. I could see her face clearly now in the dim light. She was dead. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. Whatever was standing outside my door wasn't alive in any conventional sense. Her skin had that waxy quality of a corpse. Her eyes were clouded and unfocused, and underneath the wet clothes I could see injuries that nobody survives. She raised one hand and pressed it against the window. The glass frosted over instantly where she touched it, ice spreading outward in crystalline patterns. The emergency power died. Total darkness except for the faint glow of the platform lights filtering through rain-covered windows. I sat in that darkness, listening to my own breathing, listening to the rain on the roof, listening to something else moving in the car. Footsteps that were too light, too irregular. I fumbled for my phone, activated the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, reflected off wet surfaces and metal fixtures. She was gone again. The compartment door was still closed and locked. She couldn't have gotten in, but I could smell something now, that terrible scent of stagnant water and decay, like something that had been submerged too long. Power returned as suddenly as it had failed. Lights, systems, everything coming back online simultaneously. I checked every camera feed on my monitor. The train was empty. All cars showed no passengers except the two people sleeping and the one on their phone, none of whom had moved. No sign of the woman. I sat there shaking, trying to process what I'd experienced. I could rationalize it. Equipment malfunction causing hallucinations, carbon monoxide leak creating false perceptions, extreme stress manifesting as delusions. Except I could still see the frost pattern on my compartment window where she'd touched it. Still smell that death water scent lingering in the recycled air. I completed the route. What else could I do? I drove to the end of the line, turned around, headed back. When I reached Gateway Station on the westbound return, I saw her standing on the platform. Same wet clothes, same blank expression, watching the train pass. I didn't stop. I was scheduled to stop. Passengers were waiting, but I didn't stop. I kept going, filed past the station, ignoring the confused people on the platform gesturing at the train. I drove all the way back to the depot, parked the train, and submitted my immediate resignation. My supervisor convinced me to take a week off instead of quitting, suggested I was exhausted and needed rest. I agreed, took the time, tried to forget what happened. But I kept thinking about that woman, about her insistence on reaching Gateway Station. I started researching, looking through news archives, searching for anything that might explain what I'd seen. I found it 3 days into my leave. October 2018, 3 years before my experience. Hit and run accident at Gateway Transit Center platform. Young woman struck by a vehicle in the parking structure, driver never identified. She'd been waiting for the eastbound train, had just gotten off work, was heading home. Died on scene from her injuries. The photograph accompanying the article showed her face. It was the same woman. I went back to work after my leave ended, requested transfer to a different route, any route that didn't go through Gateway. They accommodated me, put me on the West Side lines. I worked those routes for 3 months without incident. Then October 2022 arrived, exactly 1 year after my experience. I was on a completely different line, nowhere near Gateway, when my passenger assistance light activated. I knew before I checked. I knew who would be there. I called my supervisor, told him I was abandoning the train, told him they could fire me if they wanted, but I wasn't going back to that car. He sent another operator to take over, drove me back to the office himself, listened while I explained everything. He didn't seem surprised. He pulled a file from a locked drawer, showed me incident reports from other operators. October 2019, same description, same woman, same request to reach Gateway. October 2017, similar incident, though that operator had only experienced the electrical failure and cold, hadn't seen her directly. October 2015, another sighting, another emergency stop. The pattern went back to 2019, occurring every October, sometimes multiple times in the same month, always involving the Gateway to Park Rose section of the eastbound line. The transit authority had documented it, filed the reports, and done absolutely nothing. They couldn't explain it, couldn't stop it, couldn't even acknowledge it publicly without looking insane. My supervisor said most operators who experienced it either transferred to different routes or quit entirely. A few kept working the eastbound line, accepted that they'd encounter her occasionally, developed their own coping mechanisms. He said she'd never hurt anyone, never caused actual harm beyond the fear and confusion. She just appeared, asked for gateway, disrupted the electrical systems, and vanished. He had no explanation for why, no theory about what she wanted or why she couldn't reach her destination. He suggested I consider her another occupational hazard, like difficult passengers or equipment malfunctions, something to work around rather than confront. I quit for real after that conversation. I couldn't accept working in a system that acknowledged supernatural events but refused to address them, that prioritized keeping trains running on schedule over the psychological trauma of operators encountering the dead. I sometimes wonder if she's still appearing, still asking for gateway station, still trapped in whatever loop prevents her from reaching a place she died trying to get to. I wonder if anyone has tried to help her, if anyone has researched her death thoroughly enough to understand what she needs. Mostly I wonder what would have happened if I'd let her stay on the train, if I'd somehow gotten her to Gateway Station, if that would have been enough to let her rest. Have you ever felt a presence that you couldn't explain but knew was absolutely there? My name is Crew, and back in February 2004, I was working as a historical preservation assistant at Heceta Head Lighthouse in Florence, right on the Oregon coast. The position was temporary, just a 6-month contract to help catalog and digitize the lighthouse's historical documents before they were transferred to the state archives. I'd graduated with a degree in history the previous year, was excited to work with primary sources, to handle journals and logs and correspondence that hadn't been examined in decades. The lighthouse itself was beautiful, perched on a rocky headland overlooking the Pacific, still operational despite being built in 1894. The keeper's quarters had been converted into a bed and breakfast, but the archives were kept in a separate storage room in the original assistant keeper's residence. I spent my days alone in that room, sorting through boxes of documents, breathing in the smell of old paper and ocean salt. What I found in those boxes changed everything about how I understand reality. The work was solitary and methodical. I'd arrive each morning around 8, unlock the archive room, and spend hours examining documents, creating inventory lists, scanning pages for the digital collection. Most of the material was routine, maintenance logs detailing oil consumption and equipment repairs, weather observations, records of ships passing within view of the lighthouse beam. Occasionally, I'd find something more interesting, personal letters from lighthouse keepers to their families, descriptions of storms and shipwrecks, accounts of life in extreme isolation. In mid-February, I discovered a leather-bound journal tucked into the bottom of a box labeled Miscellaneous 1920, 1929. The journal wasn't cataloged in any of the existing inventories, had apparently been overlooked or deliberately hidden. The journal belonged to a keeper named Theodore, dated 1923. The early entries were unremarkable, discussing daily operations, noting repairs needed to the fog signal equipment, describing visits from supply ships. About 40 pages in, the tone shifted dramatically. Theodore began writing about seeing structures in the ocean, visible only during specific tidal conditions and only from the lighthouse gallery at certain angles. He described them as geometric, angular formations that seemed to be made of stone or metal, arranged in patterns that suggested intentional construction. He included detailed sketches in the margins, showing what looked like underwater pyramids or ziggurats covered in symbols he couldn't identify. The descriptions became increasingly obsessive. Theodore documented exact times and dates when the structures were visible, calculated lunar phases and tidal charts, tried to establish patterns. He wrote about feeling compelled to watch for them, about developing insomnia because he couldn't stop thinking about what they might be. His handwriting deteriorated across the pages, becoming more erratic and difficult to read. He mentioned tasting copper constantly, described how colors seemed too bright or too dark, depending on whether the structures were visible. The later entries included measurements and angles, mathematical calculations that covered entire pages, equations I didn't recognize despite having taken college-level math courses. I should have reported the journal immediately, should have followed proper archival procedures for unusual finds. Instead, I became obsessed with it myself. I started visiting the Lighthouse gallery during my lunch breaks, looking out at the ocean during low tide, trying to see what Theodore had documented. For the first week, I saw nothing unusual, just normal rocky coastline and kelp beds visible through the clear water. Then, on a particularly low tide during a new moon, I saw them. The structures were exactly where Theodore's sketches indicated they should be. Angular formations rising from the seafloor about 200 yards offshore, arranged in concentric circles around a central point. I grabbed my camera and took dozens of photographs, using the telephoto lens to capture as much detail as possible. The structures appeared ancient, covered in barnacles and marine growth, but the underlying geometry was unmistakably artificial. The angles were too precise, the spacing too regular to be natural rock formations. I could see symbols carved into the surfaces, similar to the ones Theodore had drawn, but eroded by decades of additional tide exposure. I felt that same compulsion he'd described, that overwhelming need to document everything, to understand what I was seeing. The copper taste appeared in my mouth, metallic and strong, like licking a battery terminal. I returned to the archive room and continued reading Theodore's journal with new urgency. The final entries were disturbing. He wrote about hearing voices in the fog signals, about the lighthouse beam carrying messages to something beneath the ocean. He described developing routines and rituals around the lighthouse operation, convinced that specific beam patterns and foghorn sequences were forms of communication. He claimed something was responding, that he could see lights underwater answering the lighthouse signal, that the geometric structures would glow faintly during certain conditions. His final entry, dated September 1923, stated simply that he understood now, that he knew what the structures wanted, that he would maintain the watch forever. I researched Theodore's history through other lighthouse records. He'd been removed from his position in October 1923 after co-workers reported erratic behavior and failure to maintain proper watch schedules. He was hospitalized briefly, diagnosed with exhaustion and possible mental breakdown, then released to family care. There was no record of what happened to him after that. I found a death certificate from 1924, cause of death listed as drowning, body recovered from the ocean near Heceta Head. The coroner's report noted he'd been in the water for several days, made identification difficult, but personal effects confirmed his identity. I started experiencing the same symptoms Theodore had described. Insomnia, unable to stop thinking about the structures, constantly calculating tides and moon phases to determine when they'd be visible again. I developed obsessive checking behaviors, visiting the gallery multiple times per day, staring at the ocean for hours. My supervisor noticed, asked if I was feeling all right, suggested I take a few days off. I refused, couldn't bear the thought of being away from the lighthouse, away from the view of those formations. The copper taste became permanent. I couldn't eat without tasting metal, couldn't drink water without it tasting like rust. I began altering my work schedule to be present during optimal viewing times. Started arriving before dawn, staying past sunset, using the lighthouse beam's rotation to illuminate the water at night. I could see them even in darkness when the beams swept across their location, could see the surfaces reflecting light in ways that stone and metal shouldn't. And Theodore had been right about the glow. During a particularly low tide at night, I watched the structures emit a faint bioluminescent pulse, blue-green light radiating from the symbols carved into their surfaces. The pulses followed patterns, rhythmic sequences that seemed to respond to the lighthouse beam's rotation. My co-worker found me one morning passed out in the gallery, hypothermic from spending the entire night watching the ocean. I'd lost track of time, forgotten I was supposed to be working in the archive room, had just stood there for 12 hours straight staring at water. She called an ambulance. The paramedics checked me over, said I was dangerously dehydrated and suffering from exposure, despite it being a relatively mild night. My supervisor suspended me, ordered me to take mandatory leave and see a doctor before returning to work. I agreed, said all the right things about taking care of myself and getting proper rest. Instead, I spent every day at the lighthouse anyway, just as a visitor rather than employee. Stood in the gallery for hours, photographing the structures, documenting their visibility patterns, filling notebooks with the same kind of obsessive calculations Theodore had done 80 years earlier. Other visitors would ask what I was looking at. What was so fascinating about empty ocean? I tried to point out the formations, but nobody else could see them. They'd look where I indicated, see only normal seafloor features, think I was confused or joking. The structures were visible only to me, only to people who'd spent enough time looking, who'd crossed some threshold of awareness. I found myself mimicking Theodore's behaviors without consciously deciding to, timing the foghorn manually, even though it was automated, trying different sequences, listening for responses that existed only in my mind, adjusting how I turned on lights in the keeper's quarters, creating patterns with the windows, convinced it mattered somehow. I knew I was losing grip on reality, knew my behavior matched Theodore's descent into whatever had consumed him. But I couldn't stop. The compulsion was too strong, the need to watch and document overwhelming every other consideration. My family intervened after 3 weeks. They'd driven up from Eugene after my supervisor called them, concerned I hadn't returned to work and wasn't answering my phone. They found me living in my car in the lighthouse parking lot, surrounded by notebooks and photographs, surviving on vending machine food. I tried to explain about the structures, showed them my documentation, begged them to just look at the right time during the right tide. They saw nothing. They saw a person who'd had some kind of breakdown, who needed immediate psychiatric help. They drove me back to Eugene, got me admitted to a hospital for evaluation. The doctors diagnosed me with obsessive-compulsive disorder triggered by stress, prescribed medication and therapy. I spent 2 weeks in inpatient care, another month in outpatient treatment. The copper taste faded gradually. My sleep patterns normalized. The compulsive thoughts about the structures diminished to manageable background noise. I was declared stable, released to continue therapy on an outpatient basis, advised to avoid returning to the lighthouse for at least a year. I never returned to that job, never finished cataloging those archives, never told anyone in an official capacity about Theodore's journal. But I kept the photographs. I kept my notebooks. And I kept watching the news from the Oregon coast, looking for reports of other people seeing structures in the water near Heceta Head. I found one article from 2011, a tourist who claimed to have photographed underwater ruins visible from the lighthouse, whose story was dismissed as misidentified rock formations. Another from 2018, a marine biologist who reported geometric anomalies on sonar scans of the area, whose findings were attributed to equipment malfunction. The structures are still there, still visible to anyone who looks long enough at the right time. And Theodore's journal is still in that archive room, still undocumented, waiting for the next person to find it and fall into the same pattern. I think about him sometimes, about his final entry claiming he'd maintain the watch forever. I think about his death by drowning, body found near the lighthouse, and I wonder if he really drowned, or if he went down to those structures deliberately, if whatever built them finally called him home. I wonder if I'll end up the same way eventually, if the compulsion will return stronger someday, if I'll find myself driving back to Florence and walking into the ocean toward formations that shouldn't exist. Mostly, I wonder whether Theodore was right, whether the lighthouse really does communicate with something beneath the waves, whether a century of keepers have been sending signals without knowing it, receiving responses they couldn't interpret. What would you do if you discovered something that nobody else could see but you knew was absolutely real? My name is Alaya, and I worked as a quality control inspector at a seafood processing facility in Astoria back in June 2012. The job wasn't glamorous. Walking through cold warehouses, checking temperatures, examining fish for parasites and contamination, making sure everything met federal health standards. But it paid decently, and Astoria didn't have many employment options if you weren't working on fishing boats or in tourism. I'd been doing health inspections for the county for 3 years, had visited dozens of processing plants, knew what violations looked like, knew when facilities were cutting corners. On June 14th, I conducted what should have been a routine surprise inspection at a facility that had been flagged for minor violations the previous quarter. What I discovered in the basement of that building still makes me wake up screaming, still makes me unable to eat seafood or work in any capacity related to food safety. The facility was called Pacific Coast Seafoods, a mid-sized operation that processed mainly salmon and halibut for regional distribution. They'd been cited 6 months earlier for inadequate refrigeration and improper waste disposal. Nothing serious enough to shut them down, but enough to warrant a follow-up inspection. I arrived without calling ahead, which was standard procedure for follow-ups. Surprise inspections catch problems that facilities hide when they know you're coming. The manager seemed nervous when I showed my credentials, which wasn't unusual. Most managers get anxious during inspections even when they're running clean operations. He tried to insist we schedule the inspection for later in the week, claimed they were short-staffed and couldn't spare someone to escort me through the facility. I informed him that wasn't how surprise inspections worked, that I'd be conducting my assessment immediately whether he cooperated or not. He assigned a floor supervisor to accompany me, a guy who looked exhausted and wouldn't make eye contact. We started on the main processing floor, and everything appeared normal. Workers at stations gutting and filleting fish, appropriate safety equipment, reasonable cleanliness standards. The refrigeration units were maintaining proper temperatures, well within acceptable ranges. Waste disposal bins were properly sealed and labeled. I was starting to think this would be a quick inspection. Maybe some minor paperwork violations, but nothing significant. Then I noticed the smell. Underneath the normal fish processing odors, there was something else. Something metallic and rotten that didn't match the usual scents of a seafood facility. I asked about it. The supervisor claimed it was just overflow from the waste processing system, said they'd had some drainage issues earlier in the week. His explanation made sense. Waste systems can back up and create terrible smells. But my training taught me to investigate discrepancies, not accept convenient explanations. I insisted on seeing the waste processing area and the facility's lower levels. The supervisor became visibly uncomfortable, said the basement was just storage, nothing relevant to food safety. That response raised red flags immediately. If there's nothing to hide, facilities show you everything without hesitation. When they start making excuses about what you can't see, that's when you know something's wrong. I pulled out my inspection authority documentation, informed him I had legal right to examine all areas of the facility, including storage and equipment spaces. He reluctantly led me to a stairwell at the back of the building, one that wasn't marked on the facility map they'd provided during my initial walkthrough. The stairs descended into a basement area that wasn't included in the original building plans filed with the county. That was another violation: unauthorized facility modifications without proper permits. The smell intensified as we went down, that metallic rot odor becoming overwhelming. I could taste it in the back of my throat, copper and decay mixing together in a way that made my stomach turn. The basement was partially finished: concrete floors and exposed pipes, lighting that was inadequate for any kind of workspace. I saw standard storage, boxes of supplies, old equipment that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Then I noticed a door at the far end, newer than the rest of the basement, with a heavy-duty lock system that seemed excessive for a storage area. I asked what was behind it. The supervisor said it was the old freezer unit, decommissioned years ago, just empty space now. I told him to open it. He claimed he didn't have the key, that only the manager could access it. I radioed up to the main office, demanded the manager come down with the key immediately. While we waited, I examined the door more carefully. There were fresh scratch marks on the floor leading up to it, like something heavy had been dragged across the concrete recently. The door frame showed signs of recent cleaning, chemical residue visible around the edges. Most tellingly, I could hear sounds from behind the door, mechanical humming, like equipment running. If this was really just empty, decommissioned space, there shouldn't be any active systems. The manager arrived looking pale and sweaty, tried one more time to convince me there was nothing relevant to my inspection behind that door. I informed him that obstruction of a health inspection was a criminal offense, that I could have law enforcement here within 20 minutes if he continued refusing access. He unlocked the door. The room beyond wasn't a decommissioned freezer. It was an active processing area, equipment running, and what was being processed wasn't fish. The smell hit me first, overwhelming and nauseating. Then I saw the drainage tables, saw what was on them, saw the tools and the systematic setup that made it clear this wasn't some isolated incident. This was organized, deliberate, ongoing. I backed out of the room immediately, pulled out my phone to call police. The manager grabbed my arm, tried to take the phone. The supervisor moved to block the stairwell exit. I'm not a large person, 5'3" and maybe 120 pounds, but I'd taken self-defense courses as part of my job training. I kneed the manager hard enough to drop him, shoved past the supervisor, and ran for the stairs. I made it halfway up before the supervisor caught my ankle, pulled me down. I kicked him in the face with my free foot, heard something crunch, kept climbing. My phone was still in my hand. I was dialing emergency services while running through the main processing floor, workers staring as I sprinted past, screaming for someone to call the police. The manager caught up to me near the front entrance. He had a filleting knife, one of the long, flexible blades they use for processing fish. He didn't say anything, just came at me with clear intent to keep me from leaving. I grabbed the nearest thing I could reach, which happened to be a fire extinguisher mounted by the door. I swung it as hard as I could, connected with his shoulder, heard him grunt in pain. He slashed at me, caught my forearm, opened a cut that immediately started bleeding heavily. I hit him again, this time in the head, and he went down. I didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. I ran out the front door, across the parking lot, didn't stop running until I reached the main road. A delivery truck driver saw me, bleeding and hysterical, and called emergency services. Police arrived within 15 minutes, ambulance right behind them. I tried to explain what I'd found while paramedics worked on my arm. The cut wasn't deep enough to need stitches, but it hurt like hell and wouldn't stop bleeding. Police went into the facility, came out 20 minutes later with the manager and supervisor in custody. They sealed the building, called in county sheriffs and state investigators. I spent 6 hours giving statements, describing exactly what I'd seen in that basement room. The investigation revealed that the facility had been disposing of human remains through their processing equipment. 3 bodies identified through DNA evidence, all transient individuals from the Portland area whose disappearances hadn't been seriously investigated. The manager had connections to the transient community, would offer work and transportation to people who wouldn't be immediately missed. He'd bring them to the facility, kill them in that basement room, and process the remains through equipment designed to handle organic material. The waste system would handle what the processing equipment reduced to small enough pieces. It had been going on for at least 2 years before I stumbled onto it. The trial lasted 8 months. I had to testify, had to describe in detail what I saw in that room, had to look at photographs that investigators had taken. The manager was convicted of 3 counts of murder, received life without parole. The supervisor was convicted as an accomplice, got 40 years. The facility was permanently shut down, building eventually demolished. I couldn't work in food safety anymore after that. The smell, the taste of metal when I'd been in that basement, the knowledge of what human remains look like when processed through industrial equipment designed for fish. It all made it impossible to do my job. I had panic attacks walking into kitchens, couldn't handle the smell of seafood cooking, couldn't look at processing plants without remembering what I'd found. I ended up changing careers completely, work in an office now doing data entry, as far from food and industrial facilities as I could get. I still have nightmares about that basement room, about what the manager would have done if I hadn't gotten away, about the 3 people who died there. I carry guilt that I didn't inspect more thoroughly during the initial visit 6 months earlier, that if I'd been more suspicious, then maybe I could have caught this before the 3rd victim died. The county offered counseling, which helped some, but there are experiences that therapy can't erase, images that don't fade no matter how much time passes. I think about those victims sometimes, try to remember their names and faces from the trial, try to honor their memory by acknowledging what happened to them. They were people nobody was looking for, people society had forgotten about or given up on, which is exactly why the manager targeted them. He'd counted on nobody investigating when they disappeared, counted on being able to hide his crimes in plain sight at a licensed, inspected facility. If I hadn't trusted my instincts about that smell, about his evasive answers, he might still be operating. That thought terrifies me more than anything. The idea that someone could run a legitimate business as cover for systematic murder, that the infrastructure of normal commerce could hide such extreme horror. Would you have pushed for access to that locked room, or would you have accepted the manager's explanations and moved on with your inspection? My name is Letty, and in November 2017, I was a graduate research assistant at Portland State University working in the psychology department. Specifically, I assisted with a sleep study examining the effects of auditory stimulation on dream states. The lead researcher, a professor who'd spent decades studying consciousness and lucid dreaming, had developed a hypothesis about using specific frequency patterns to induce controlled dream experiences. The study promised groundbreaking results, potential applications for treating nightmares and sleep disorders, maybe even therapeutic uses for trauma processing. I believed in the work completely, trusted the scientific method, trusted that we were operating within ethical boundaries. November 7th shattered that trust and showed me that some doors of perception should never be opened, that consciousness can access spaces we're not meant to visit. The study protocol seemed straightforward when I signed on as an assistant. We recruited 12 participants who would sleep in separate observation rooms equipped with EEG monitors and specialized audio equipment. During specific sleep stages, particularly REM cycles, we'd expose participants to carefully calibrated frequency patterns designed to enhance dream awareness without fully waking them. Each session lasted 6 hours overnight, with participants compensated well for their time. We'd been running preliminary trials for 3 months without significant issues. Participants reported vivid dreams. Some described increased dream control, but nothing alarming. Standard research progression, careful documentation, incremental adjustments to the audio parameters. The session on November 7th started normally. All 12 participants checked in around 10 at night, completed pre-study questionnaires, settled into their assigned rooms. I monitored the central control station where all the EEG feeds and audio systems were managed. My role involved tracking brainwave patterns, noting when participants entered REM sleep, activating the audio stimulation at appropriate times, and documenting any anomalies. The lead researcher had left earlier that evening for a conference presentation, trusted me to handle the overnight session independently since I'd been doing it for weeks. Around 1 in the morning, all 12 participants entered REM sleep simultaneously, which was unusual but not impossible. I activated the audio sequence according to protocol. The frequencies played normally for about 15 minutes. Then participants started reporting dream content through the communication system we'd installed for tracking lucid experiences. We'd trained them to speak aloud when they became aware they were dreaming, to describe what they were experiencing. What disturbed me immediately was that they all started describing the same location. Not similar dreams or related themes, but identical environments down to specific details. They all described a vast space, with architecture that hurt to perceive, angles that folded impossibly, structures extending in directions they couldn't name. They all mentioned feeling watched by something massive and ancient. They all reported seeing each other in the shared space, interacting despite being physically separated in individual rooms. I checked the audio equipment, thinking maybe there'd been some cross-contamination between rooms. Some way the communication system was bleeding through, allowing them to hear each other's descriptions. Everything showed normal operation, each room isolated, no signal interference. I reviewed the EEG patterns. All 12 participants showed identical brainwave synchronization, their neural activity matching perfectly across all monitored frequencies. That wasn't possible through our equipment. We were playing audio to induce certain brain states, not directly linking neural activity between people. Yet their brain waves were moving in perfect unison, like they were somehow connected. Around 1:45, the equipment malfunctioned. Not a gradual failure or single component breaking, but every system simultaneously experiencing problems. The audio frequency spiked beyond what our equipment could produce, jumping to levels that should have damaged the speakers. The EEG monitors began showing readings that violated basic neuroscience, wave patterns with amplitudes far beyond normal human brain activity, frequencies that shouldn't exist in biological systems. Participants started seizing simultaneously in all 12 rooms. I initiated emergency shutdown, killed power to the audio systems, activated the alarm to wake participants. Nothing stopped the seizures. They continued convulsing, EEG readings climbing to impossible levels, while I called emergency services and tried to physically enter rooms to help. 11 participants came out of the seizures after about 90 seconds, waking confused and disoriented but physically intact. One participant, a graduate student from the engineering department, didn't wake up. His EEG showed continuing activity, brain still in a highly active state, but he remained completely unresponsive. Paramedics arrived, transported him to the hospital along with several other participants showing concerning symptoms. I stayed behind to secure the facility and document what happened, knowing we'd face immediate investigation for what looked like a catastrophic research failure. I was reviewing security footage when I noticed something impossible. During the seizure event, all 12 participants had been moving identically, their physical convulsions synchronized perfectly despite being in separate rooms. Frame-by-frame analysis showed them moving in exact unison, every muscle contraction matching across all camera feeds. The lead researcher returned the next morning, reviewed my documentation, looked at the data files, and instead of expressing shock or concern, seemed excited. He pulled files from his office safe, showed me research he'd been conducting in parallel with the official study. He'd been secretly manipulating the audio frequencies, introducing parameters not approved in our research protocol, specifically attempting to create shared dream spaces between participants. He'd been building toward this result deliberately, using the official study as cover for unauthorized experimentation. He showed me earlier session data I'd never seen, evidence that participants had been experiencing shared dream elements for weeks, increasingly overlapping experiences that he'd been carefully cultivating. I confronted him about ethics violations, about conducting experiments without informed consent, about the participant currently in a coma. He dismissed my concerns, insisted the breakthrough justified the risks, that we'd discovered something revolutionary about consciousness. He showed me historical research going back decades, other scientists who'd attempted similar experiments, documentation of previous shared dream experiences, theories about consciousness existing in spaces beyond physical reality. He claimed we'd successfully mapped a route into this space, that with refinement the technique could allow reliable access to what he called consensus reality, a domain where multiple minds could interact outside physical constraints. I reported everything to the University Ethics Board, provided all documentation, described the unauthorized modifications to approved research protocols. The lead researcher was suspended pending investigation. The study was immediately shut down, but the damage had been done. The comatose participant never regained consciousness, remained in a persistent vegetative state for 6 weeks before his family made the decision to withdraw life support. The other 11 participants all reported continuing problems. They couldn't stop dreaming about that shared space, couldn't stop visiting it whenever they fell asleep. Several described encountering something non-human there, an intelligence that had noticed them when they first arrived, that continued watching them, following them through their dreams. The university investigation concluded there had been serious ethical violations, but couldn't establish direct causation between the unauthorized frequency modifications and the participant's death. The lead researcher was terminated, lost his license to conduct human subject research, but faced no criminal charges. The study data was classified as confidential due to ongoing litigation from participants' families. I testified in several civil cases, described what I'd witnessed, helped lawyers establish the timeline of negligence. All cases settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. I left academia completely, couldn't continue in research after seeing how badly things could go wrong, how easily scientific curiosity could become reckless experimentation. But the worst part isn't the career change or the guilt about not stopping the unauthorized research sooner. The worst part is that I listened to recordings of what participants said during that session, heard their descriptions of what they encountered in that shared space, and I've started dreaming about it too. Even though I wasn't connected to the equipment, wasn't exposed to the frequencies, I dream about that impossible architecture, about vast presences moving through spaces my mind can barely comprehend. I see the other participants there sometimes, 11 people I met during the study, wandering through endless corridors that exist nowhere physical. They see me too, recognize me, ask why I'm there when I was never part of the experiment. I've visited sleep specialists, tried every medication and therapy to stop the dreams. Nothing works. I go to that place every night, spend hours walking through spaces that follow rules different from reality, avoiding the attention of things that live there. I've documented everything, kept dream journals, tried to map the geography of this space that shouldn't exist. The structure is consistent across dreams. The same landmarks always in the same positions, the same entities encountered in predictable patterns. It's not random dream imagery. It's a real place that consciousness can access, a place the study accidentally opened a door to, and now some of us can't close that door. The lead researcher contacted me 6 months ago through an anonymous email account, said he's still researching the phenomenon, still documenting the shared space using data from the 11 surviving participants who've maintained contact with him. He claims they're mapping an entirely new dimension of human consciousness, that the tragedy was unfortunate, but the scientific discovery justifies continuing. He invited me to participate in follow-up studies he's conducting independently, outside academic oversight. I refused, blocked his communications, reported his contact to authorities. But part of me wonders if he's right, if understanding this space might be the only way to escape it, if mapping what we accidentally discovered could lead to controlling it rather than being trapped by it. If you could access a dimension where minds connect directly but risked never being able to leave, would you take that chance? My name is Khalid, and I work as a highway maintenance supervisor for the Oregon Department of Transportation. I've been doing this job for 11 years, managing crews that keep Highway 26 clear and safe between Government Camp and Mount Hood Meadows. It's demanding work, especially during winter, when storms roll through the Cascade Range, dropping feet of snow overnight. We run 12-hour shifts clearing roads, treating ice, responding to accidents, pulling stranded motorists out of ditches. You see a lot working overnight maintenance in mountain conditions, deal with every kind of weather emergency imaginable, encounter situations that test your skills and your nerves. But nothing in 11 years prepared me for what my crew and I experienced during the storm on January 19th, 2023. The forecast that evening predicted heavy snowfall, typical for mid-January at elevation. We mobilized our full overnight crew, 3 snowplows with operators, 2 support vehicles with sand and salt, and me supervising in a heavy-duty pickup equipped with communications gear and emergency supplies. We started clearing operations around 8 at night, working our way up Highway 26 from Government Camp toward the ski areas. Visibility was poor but manageable, temperatures hovering around 15 degrees, steady snow accumulation requiring multiple passes to keep the road accessible. By midnight, we'd completed 2 full clearing runs and were heading back up for a 3rd pass when our radio communications started experiencing interference. The static wasn't normal. It had patterns in it, almost like vocalizations, but at wrong frequencies, sounds that made my teeth ache when they came through the speakers. All 3 plow operators reported hearing it simultaneously across different radio channels. I switched frequencies multiple times, checked our equipment, confirmed we weren't picking up interference from nearby commercial stations or emergency services. The sounds continued, rising and falling in waves that seemed to match the rhythm of the snowfall. One of my operators, a guy who'd been doing this work longer than I had, said it sounded like something screaming very far away. I told him to stay focused on clearing, that we'd investigate the radio issue once we finished the shift. Around 1:15 in the morning, we encountered the first abandoned vehicle, a pickup truck sitting sideways across the eastbound lane, driver's door hanging open, engine still running, headlights cutting through the falling snow. No tire tracks leading away, no footprints visible despite fresh snow that should have shown recent disturbances. I pulled up behind it with my flashers on, grabbed my radio and flashlight, approached the vehicle carefully. The interior was warm, keys in the ignition, a half-full coffee cup in the holder still steaming, personal items scattered across the seats, a wallet, a phone, a jacket. Nobody inside, nobody visible anywhere around the vehicle. Called out, searched the immediate area, found nothing. The phone was unlocked. Most recent call had been made 20 minutes earlier to emergency services, but dispatch had no record of receiving any calls from this number. I reported the situation to dispatch, requested police response for the abandoned vehicle. While waiting, we discovered 2 more vehicles in similar condition over the next half-mile of highway. Both empty, engines running, doors open, occupants vanished. One was a sedan with 4 coffee cups and multiple jackets, suggesting a group traveling together. The other was a commercial delivery van with shipping manifest dated that day. Cargo still secured in the back. No signs of struggle, no blood, No indication of what happened to the drivers or passengers. The snow was coming down heavily enough that tracks would have filled in within minutes, but there should have been some indication of direction, some evidence of people walking away. There was nothing. My crew was getting spooked. The radio interference intensified, those strange vocalizations becoming louder and more distinct. One operator swore he could hear words in it, though he couldn't understand the language. I ordered everyone to stay in their vehicles, maintain visual contact with each other, keep moving forward while we documented the abandoned vehicles for police response. We continued clearing the highway, finding another 4 abandoned vehicles over the next 3 miles, all showing the same pattern. Engines running, doors open, occupants gone. 9 vehicles total, potentially 15 or more missing people, vanished during a snowstorm on an active highway. Then we saw it. Something massive moving through the trees parallel to the highway, visible only when our plow lights swept across the forest. It was tall, far taller than anything natural, moving on 2 legs, but with proportions completely wrong. The body was too long, the limbs too thin, covered in white fur or hair that blended with the falling snow. I got only glimpses through the storm, brief moments of illumination showing something that shouldn't exist. The operators saw it too, all 3 reporting the same sighting on different parts of the road, describing movements that suggested incredible speed despite the creature's size. One of my operators radioed that something had impacted his plow, a collision hard enough to rock the entire truck. He'd seen nothing in front of him. No object on the road, just a sudden massive blow against the passenger side of his vehicle. When I pulled alongside to inspect damage, I saw claw marks gouged into the steel plow blade, deep scratches running nearly 4 feet long. The marks were fresh, metal bright, and exposed where something had torn through the paint and protective coating. I photographed the damage, measured the claw spacing, tried to think of any animal large enough and strong enough to damage heavy equipment that way. Nothing made sense. The creature appeared again, this time much closer to the road. I got a clear view through my windshield for maybe 5 seconds before it vanished back into the trees. It stood over 12 feet tall, humanoid shape but elongated, arms reaching nearly to the ground. The face was primate-like, but larger, with features that seemed too intelligent, too aware. It was watching us, studying our vehicles, displaying curiosity rather than aggression. In one massive hand, it carried something I recognized as a piece of torn metal. Holding it carefully, examining it like a tool, the realization that this thing could use objects deliberately, that it demonstrated problem-solving behavior, was more terrifying than its size or appearance. I made the decision to evacuate. Whatever we were dealing with was beyond our training and equipment. I ordered the crew to turn around, to head back toward government camp, to get off this section of highway immediately. We started the descent in formation, maintaining close spacing, all lights and flashers active. The creature followed us. I could see it moving through the forest, pacing our vehicles, occasionally crossing the road behind us. It stayed just at the edge of visibility, a massive shadow moving through the storm. The radio interference reached painful levels, forcing us to abandon radio communication entirely and rely on visual signals. Something struck my truck from behind, a collision that shattered my rear window and caved in part of the bed. I accelerated, trying to maintain control on the snow-covered road, watching in my mirrors as the creature emerged fully onto the highway behind me. It had thrown something, a boulder or chunk of ice, with enough force to seriously damage my vehicle from 50 yards away. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was a deliberate attack, a test of our vehicle's vulnerabilities. The creature was hunting us. The 3-mile descent to government camp took 30 minutes that felt like hours. The creature pursued us the entire way, throwing debris that impacted our vehicles multiple times. 2 of the plow trucks sustained significant damage. Windshields cracked, body panels dented. 1 operator suffering a shoulder injury from debris that came through a side window. We radioed ahead to the highway patrol station at government camp, tried to explain what was happening, requested emergency backup. The dispatcher's responses suggested they thought we were experiencing some kind of weather-related hysteria, that stress from the storm was causing panic. We reached government camp just before 2 in the morning, pulled into the patrol station parking lot, and the creature stopped pursuing. It stood at the edge of town, visible in the streetlights, watching us. Highway patrol officers came out to meet us, saw the creature clearly, radioed for additional units. By the time backup arrived 15 minutes later, the creature was gone. But the evidence remained. 9 abandoned vehicles scattered across 3 miles of highway, 15 missing people, 4 heavily damaged maintenance vehicles, dozens of photographs and radio recordings documenting the incident. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. Search and rescue teams combed the forest along that section of highway, found no trace of the missing people. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns, detected nothing. The abandoned vehicles were towed and processed. Forensics found no evidence of foul play, no indication of what happened to the occupants. All 9 vehicles just showed people who'd stopped or been stopped, then left their vehicles and vanished. My crew's injuries and vehicle damage were documented, claw mark measurements taken, fur samples collected from 1 plow blade analyzed. DNA testing showed no match to any known species, results classified as inconclusive. The official report attributed the incident to stress-induced mass hallucination, possibly caused by carbon monoxide exposure from running vehicles in poor ventilation conditions. The vehicle damage was explained as impact from road debris thrown up during plowing operations. The missing people were classified as separate cases unrelated to each other, despite all disappearing from the same road segment within the same hour. My crew and I were offered counseling for trauma, given paid leave to recover from our stressful experience. We were strongly encouraged not to discuss the incident publicly, warned that spreading panic about imaginary creatures would damage the department's credibility. 4 of the missing people were never found. The other 11 turned up over subsequent weeks in various states, miles from Oregon, with no memory of how they got there or what happened during the missing time. Medical examinations showed signs of exposure and frostbite consistent with spending extended periods outdoors in freezing conditions. None could explain where they'd been or why they'd left their vehicles. Several described fragmented memories of being carried through forest, of something large and white holding them, of being deposited in random locations and waking confused and disoriented. I transferred to a different district 6 months later, couldn't continue working that section of highway, couldn't drive through that area without experiencing panic attacks. My crew scattered to different positions, some leaving highway maintenance entirely. We maintain contact, share information when new reports surface, because the creature is still there. Hikers report sightings every few months, describe something massive moving through the forest above the snowline. Winter maintenance crews experience equipment damage and radio interference in that same stretch of highway. People continue disappearing from vehicles during storms, though the incidents are never connected officially, always explained away as isolated cases of individuals wandering off in confusion. The department keeps detailed internal records that they don't share publicly. I've seen some of the files through contacts who still work there, reports of similar incidents going back 40 years, descriptions matching what we encountered, patterns of disappearances and damaged equipment that repeat every winter. The department knows something lives in those mountains, something territorial and intelligent, something that occasionally interacts with humans in ways that can't be explained or controlled. They manage it through silence, through dismissing reports, through ensuring official explanations always sound more reasonable than the truth. I sometimes wonder what would happen if it came down to lower elevations, if it entered populated areas during a major storm, if it decided to do more than just watch and test our vehicles. That creature demonstrated intelligence and tool use, showed capability for complex hunting behavior, displayed strength that could easily kill if it chose to. We were lucky it seemed more curious than aggressive that night. But luck runs out eventually, and every winter I worry about the crews still working that highway, still encountering something their training never prepared them for. If you saw something that everyone else denied existed, would you keep speaking the truth or stay silent to protect yourself? That's it for tonight's collection of disturbing Oregon horror stories. If these accounts left you unsettled, you're not alone. Remember, the most terrifying tales aren't always fiction. They're the experiences people actually live through, the encounters that defy explanation. Subscribe to Unheard Fears for more true horror stories that will make you question what's really possible. Drop your own unexplained experiences in the comments below and stay safe out there.